Welcome back. For years, there have been stories about how some airlines actually defer fixing broken parts or systems, and it's all legal. The Federal Aviation Administration has specific timeframes for repairs of certain items. Most people have no idea until something goes wrong. A passenger on board a Southwest flight was recently killed when an engine exploded, sending shrapnel into the cabin. 60 Minutes just did an investigation into deferred maintenance on the Legion Airlines, which flies in and out of SRQ and other local airports. And joining us for more is Buck Greenlaw, a former aviation consultant. And Buck, help us here, because in Adam's story you said you would not fly low-cost airlines like Allegiant, but then you had Rick Piccolo, who's head of the airport, say no problem here. They're flying newer aircraft.
Well, that is true. They, for years, had a number of the older MD-80 series aircraft, which had serious problems with maintenance because these were 20 to 30-year-old airplanes. But yes, but one of the biggest problems from my experience, is that it's a culture that is still there. I think that's something that's very, very difficult to change.
Well, let me ask you about that, because, and I've done a number of stories over the years about deferred maintenance issues, and some people point to basically a contradicting mission statement of the FAA, that part of their job is to promote the airline industry. The other part is to hold airlines accountable and make sure that the aircraft are safe, and sometimes
they do. Absolutely, both at the airline level and at the general aviation level, because that's the sort of thing that I have experienced as well. So it is difficult, it really is. But I would point out, I think that airline flying overall is far safer than it used to be let's say pre-80 as compared to today. Personally, I have never had, in all my experience, I've never had a problem.
All right, we have to take a quick break, and we'll be back with Buck in just a moment. Welcome back. We're talking about deferred maintenance on airliners, and joining us for more is Buck Greenlaw, a former aviation consultant. Buck, one of the problems in our neck of the woods around here, whether we're talking about Sarasota International, Bradenton International Airport, or even Tampa, is that these are not major hubs, and therefore when an airplane breaks here, you do not have a large maintenance department that can fix big things.
Absolutely. So they typically have someone come in from, if it's Delta, from Atlanta or whatever the airline is.
And that's how we have situations where, as I mentioned, you can defer maintenance on certain, even flight critical items for a certain amount of period under certain circumstances.
Yes, as long as there's something that can offset that will duplicate that. And that's a very, very fine line there, I think, because when you look at the manuals that are approved for the airlines, you may see slight differences between, let's say, Deltas and Americans and Uniteds. It's how it's approved by the FAA, and they're supposed to be following that manual to the detail.
And another, you mentioned manuals, and that's fortuitous because the whole way airlines maintain their aircraft has changed over the years. They used to have large facilities where they would do this kind of work, but more and more, correct me if I'm wrong, they're sending these aircraft to Mexico or South America or even China to get them repaired. We don't have to worry about folks from Central America coming into the country and taking our jobs. No, we're sending it to them.
Absolutely. Let me kind of clarify that just a little bit, because in airline maintenance, basically there's basically four phases: A, B, C, D type maintenance. A stuff would be very simple stuff, oil changes, that sort of thing. And then the B check would be done at a certain number of hours or cycles, and then C would be something beyond that. The D's would be the real heavy maintenance. That's where the airplane has been flying probably for over 6 years, at least that probably. And it's basically taking the airplane apart and putting it back together. I mean, they take the engines off, they're rebuilt and everything, but to save money, that can go to China, it can go to San Salvador, it can go to Hong Kong.
I mean, it occurs to me that, you know, the manuals for these aircraft are written in English, and you're sending them to workers who may not speak or be able to read English.
Yes, you have to have at least a certain number of people there with the airframe and power plant ratings. Now, they're supposed to be able to speak, read, write, and speak the English language. as a former examiner issuing over 1,000 ratings over 23 years, that was one of the criteria. You had to make certain that that person could speak, read, and understand the English language.
So what do you make of to the facts that we were talking about in Adam's story, that on one hand, and even today, we're seeing aircraft with smoke in the cockpit. We've had a number of situations recently, a woman killed on a Southwest flight. But on the other hand, the safety record for the airlines over the last decade has been spectacular.
It really has. My experience after 55 years in this business, that we see those clusters over time. You notice that what's happening. You know, you ask that obvious question: why aren't they doing their job? And then you can go for long periods of times, and we're not seeing that. But I think this is unfortunately one of those times. It just seems to. They all come together, unfortunately.
What do you think of the FAA philosophy as of the last few years, that instead of fining and citing airlines for maintenance deficiencies that come up, that they are pulling back on that and basically taking the position of working with the airlines to fix it and not coming down hard on them?
Really, it boils down to the FAA not having the personnel to do the job. Let me give you kind of an example. Running a shop back in 1980, when the FAA had a very good budget and a lot of personnel. I'd get a knock on the door and someone would show up, and it's the guy from the FAA. He's there to inspect my operation. He said, bring that airplane in, take the cowling off and do this. And they actually inspect that. They can't do that today. It becomes less that they're relying on the operation, whether it's a small general aviation repair station or operation or an airline type operation. The personnel are just not there from the FAA.
When did that change?
That was just a slow progressive change over the years. But I would say in 1980, by the time I kind of got out of the business around, or basically retired in 2004, you would see an FAA inspector come in and want to look simply at your logbooks, never look at the airplane, want to make sure the records were correct, that they were signed correctly, everything, all the I's dotted and the T's crossed.
So what would you tell folks who are watching this now, who, you know, if you live and work around here, you're traveling a lot, and on one hand, you're seeing an overall safety record that seems pretty safe over the last decade. On the other hand, you're seeing in black and white horrific stories over the last few weeks that really should give anyone pause.
I know. I would say personally, I have no fear of flying. I have personally never had an accident myself, teaching all the pilots that I've taught, or on an airline. I've never been involved in any kind of, even an incident in all these years. So I know that sort of thing comes, but I also look, as I told my wife, one death since '09, and in that period of time we've had some 250,000 people killed on the road. I mean, how do you, I know if I also showed you people a stack of airworthiness directives that are on all aircraft, that's large, small, helicopters, gliders, they're books that are probably,
and I have gone through those records, and if you read them, if you just take them, you know, factually, it would scare the dickens out of most people. Yes, it would.
The average person on the street.
But that obviously does not translate into real accidents on massive scales.
No. See, each airline, each repair station, every time they find a problem, they're required by law to fill out this statement that has to be submitted to the FAA, and they compile those, and as they see trends developing of that same problem with, let's say, American, United, and so forth, put those together and send out a bulletin.
We have less than a minute left, but I want to ask you one more question. It's kind of political, but given the number of incidents we've had recently, when you look at congressional oversight and the government's willingness to do anything about anything these days, do you think that there would be any kind of crackdown?
Well, as I said in my previous piece on this station, that I think the FAA has to go back and seriously look at some of the maintenance procedures that are being performed. I really do. But
that needs time and money.
Yeah, it does. It really does. And of course, with the lack of personnel at the FAA level. I think just one other quick comment. There's the FAA at the national level, but having worked out of 3 regions as an examiner, they each have their own culture as well. So that has an impact as well. There's the FAA, then there's the FAA, then there's the FAA.
All right, we have to leave it there, but thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you to Buck Greenlaw, who is a former aviation consultant, for joining us tonight.